Hi, I'm Stuart Buchanan. I'm Head of Digital Programming at Sydney Opera House. Before we kick off, I want to acknowledge the traditional owners of the land on which we're gathering here today for this conference, and pay my respects to elders past, present, and emerging. Where to begin with this topic? Well, it's always, I kind of wanted to continue on from the last panel that we had, which was, I enjoyed very much the presentation, but the panel then seemed to get into a little bit of a spicy territory, which I really enjoyed. So I think I wanted to begin today's panel by encouraging us to be as honest and forthright as possible, and if we veer into spicy territory, then maybe all the better. Be thinking about some questions that you might want to ask of the panel. Clearly, spicier the better. There'll be some opportunities, obviously, for us to have that discussion afterwards. Now, we've got quite a varied panel here today in terms of, I guess, kind of experience with, exposure with, to, and working with technology. And I kind of wanted to kind of give a little bit of brief context about how we might talk about technology in this panel. When we talk about live performance, the go-to is often a live stream or a recording of a performance. Sometimes what we talk about at the Opera House is kind of pointing cameras at the stage. That's a pretty valid and common process, and so we will talk about that. We will also talk about works that are designed, I guess, exclusively for film, or for screen, rather. So still performance in their nature, but not necessarily presented in front of a live audience. And we also talk about digital. We talk about collaboration. We talk about learning. We talk about infrastructure, and we talk about engagement within a variety of different digital frameworks. So we'll touch on all of these. Now, I've already broken my rule that I try and impose upon myself, which is not to use the word digital. How many times have we heard the word digital today? Try as best we can maybe to see if we can not use the word digital and see how much of a tongue tie that gets us into. One of the things I should also point out, obviously, that everybody sitting on the panel here today, or rather my three colleagues, have been mentees as part of the CEO Digital Mentoring. There was digital there, sorry, it's inherent in the title. I can't get around that one. The CEO Mentoring Program. I was fortunate enough to be one of the mentors in the first and second round. And in both of the rounds, actually, the wonderful mentees that I was working with, some of the outcomes was actually to put the idea of a digital strategy to one side and think about the placement of digital, of technology within an overriding either artistic or organizational strategy. So this kind of, this was actually an idea I think Seb introduced very early on, that it's very easy to compartmentalize an other digital as being off to one side as a problem that can be solved, as opposed to centralizing it within organizational strategies and frameworks. That's a bit of a rambling setup for you, so let's get into questions. Let's kick off with something fairly kind of straightforward and I think interesting to start the conversation, which is actually perhaps none of what doesn't fall into any of the categories that I started with, which is the recent productions of Picture of Dorian Gray and Jekyll and Hyde as part of the Sydney Theatre Company, because those are certainly within, I guess, a kind of state-based theatre company, are some of the most innovative presentation works as far as technologies go. Can you just give us a little bit of what are they and what led to their kind of creation?
First of all, let me just correct you when you say straightforward, because they are not that. There are many things, but they are not that. So Picture of Dorian Gray, and it had a run here in Melbourne last year, and it's currently on stage in Sydney, about to go to Auckland for the Auckland Festival. And Strange Case of Dr. Jekyll and Mr. Hyde is currently on stage in Perth at Perth Festival and about to go to Adelaide Festival. So they're pieces of work that were adapted from the original books and directed by our artistic director, Kip Williams, and they are what he terms cine theatre. So live theatre on stage, but interspersed with live cameras on stage. So 5 cameras on stage in a mix of Steadicams, tripods, programmed jibs, which do a mix of performance direct to audience, performance to camera. There's some pre-recorded content, which is then live mixed through a media server and played, so that in the picture of Dorian Gray, one performer plays 26 characters across a 2-hour performance, with only probably about 5% of the content kind of pre-recorded. So most of it is live, with costume changes live on stage, so an incredibly complex technical team around it, and also stage management and sort of props and wardrobe team around it. And Jekyll and Hyde is similar, 2 performers this time, playing also multiple characters. And it's this interesting thing about these kind of Victorian Gothic pieces transformed through very contemporary technology. So in terms of the audience interaction of it, it provides this incredibly contemporary access into what otherwise might be quite a dated feeling story. So that's, but as I say, none of it is straightforward.
The use of the word cine theatre there. I don't know if anyone had cine theatre on their bingo, but that's a new one, which is great to hear. I mean, obviously those choices inherent in the idea of presenting cine theatre are artistic choices driven by Kip. But maybe to draw on something that actually we covered off in the last panel, like how much of that is also audience-led insofar as the proclivities of the audience towards screen-based culture, let's say, and bringing that into the live performance context?
Look, I mean, I think so Kip's been playing around in this form for a while. This is not the first production of that nature, but it's probably the 2 productions that have pushed the edge of the envelope. And it's audience-led in that, you know, Sydney Theatre Company is an incredibly box office-driven company. 70% of our revenue comes from box office. So you learn pretty quick whether audiences like something or not. And to the earlier point about where's the role of audience in this conversation, for us it's a massive driver in where we prioritise things and how we structure the business going forward, because we need audiences to stay afloat, bluntly, and they need to buy tickets. It's not these are not engagement pieces, although obviously there's those pathways, but there is a commercial reality that one has to take into account when going, are we going to embark on another of these? And they've had incredible audience appeal. Audiences love them because they are really innovative, they're really interesting, and there's this kind of sense of unexpectedness as you engage with these stories through this means. Whether there's something that the audience said, we want this thing, and then we created it, it's been an iterative relationship development over time.
Okay. We'll come back to the question of recording and live streaming in a second. But Kath, here to my left, now you have the privilege of presenting Picture of Dorian Gray as part of the upcoming Adelaide Festival. What sort of challenges does that type of live theatre present, and how might they differ from other types of works that can be presented in a festival context?
Yeah, thank you. We're doing Jekyll and Hyde. Actually,
Sorry,
we did Dorian Gray
please.
last year
Yes.
to massive success. What a wonderful piece. And yeah, so we're following up with Jekyll and Hyde, which we're very pleased to be doing. And I can confirm, Anne is correct, they're not straightforward in their, you know, one person on stage. It's not a fringe one-person show, that's for sure. But I think what you're saying there about audiences and access is really important. And you know, Kip and other directors aren't responding directly to what audiences want, but they are thinking about what does an audience, you know, what do they want to sit through, what do they want to see, what are the stories that they want to hear. And I think the great thing about the theatrical staging of Dorian Gray and Jekyll and Hyde is that it is very accessible. The story of Jekyll and Hyde is very accessible. You know what it is. It's gothic, it's noir, there's a lot of that stuff around. But then the cinematic, cine theatre presentation of it does give another way into it when we talk about it too. We have various donor groups in Adelaide, and we do a sort of Shark Tank, kind of what do you want to put your support to, and we pitch.
I want to see that.
Yes, we won't. It's a small thing in somebody's house, but we various of us pitch different parts of the programme to that group to see what they want to support, and they overwhelmingly wanted to support Jekyll and Hyde, having seen Dorian Gray, because of the accessibility of it and the excitement of the way that it's presented. And I think that, you know, we talk about technology, or if we're thinking about how technology is changing performance, I think when it works best, it's when a director is using it because as another tool in a director's toolkit. So it's something else that will help really tell the story in a way. So it's not about using video or live streaming or whatever for the sake of it. It's about how do I, if I want to tell this big story with all of these multiple characters, how can I do that in a way that doesn't involve me employing 26 actors or whatever? And the result of that, I think, is often something that pushes the art form a little bit more.
During COVID, we saw, obviously, that some types of festivals were able to adapt to the environment very quickly. And I'm thinking particularly film festivals and writers' festivals, film festivals where works could be screened online, obviously writers' festivals moving to a kind of Zoom-style presentation. In thinking about how the last couple of years have propelled transformation, do you think as a, dare I say, more traditional performing arts festival that you might have somehow missed out on some of that transformation because you weren't necessarily as, I'm not going to say compelled to do so, but less able to adapt to that changing environment?
Yeah, I think about that a lot. I mean, we are a very traditional festival. We're thinking all the time, and we've got new artistic leadership now about how we build on the incredible success that traditional festival has brought us to really think about how we widen our reach and our access. But I was in Melbourne for most of the pandemic, and then went to South Australia where it's not a competition and everybody has had a horrible time in the pandemic, of course, but in South Australia, in Adelaide, it was not the same situation. An Adelaide Festival in 2020 happened entirely as normal, and then the lockdown happened at midnight on the last night. In the year that Rising didn't even get announced in Melbourne. 21 was impacted. There weren't internationals, but actually the festival did some commissioning and live streaming of work from Moscow, Berlin, London into theatres in Adelaide, and the audience went to watch them there to try and keep that international component. And interestingly, actually, from an access perspective, then also streamed them out into Mount Gambier and Waiala and into the region, so that was a nice kind of access thing. And then in 22, the festival that we had last year was pretty much, apart from a 75% density quotient, pretty much back to normal. We did Rites of Spring with actors and dancers from 35 countries who all made it in. So it was a very normal kind of world, and that's been great and very, a very successful thing for Adelaide Festival. But I think a lot about how everywhere else, and what certainly we were doing here at Rising, really looking at, all right then, what is the value of what we do if we can't do the thing that we do, and what's our responsibility to our artists and to our sector and to our organisations and our staff, and how are we kind of innovating and melding ourselves around that. And we haven't done that so much in Adelaide, and I think we will have to. I think that will have an impact. I don't know if that's positive or negative or not, but I think we will have to think about that kind of examination as we go forward.
It's a nice segue, Jamie, to you in terms of Next Wave Festival, because that, over the last couple of years, has undergone a significant transformation from a festival model to year-round project-based commissioning model, or essentially kind of always-on framework, for want of a better word. Can you talk a little bit about what brought about that change, and how much of it was pandemic-led and how much of it was more broadly just in lockstep with how things are evolving?
Hi. It was not pandemic-led in that I think I came into the organization having a practice as an artist and an understanding of the sector from a few different perspectives. And I think coming in and seeing Next Wave from the outside as an alumni of the festival, as well as over a couple of different years, and then as a peer assessing grants and seeing those applications come through and all that sort of stuff. I think there was a sense of where the organization was at. And then when I inherited the organization at the start of 2021, in the middle of lockdown as well, there was a real question of like, well, what are we actually doing, and for who and how, and is this really the best way to support early career artists as the organization is set up to do? But I think the pandemic gave me permission to maybe push further than anticipated, maybe, and with a little less resistance than I also anticipated, which is something I, understand as a real privilege and joy. But yeah, I think at the heart of the transformation was really about asking, okay, what is our current set of resourcing? the reality of that. We have we don't have federal organizational funding. We have state organizational funding, and then we're relying on project funding. So like, what can we actually do, and how can we also funnel the maximum resourcing back to artists? And then I think also, I think the context of the cultural sector, we can't talk about centering First Nations voices or people across a diversity of lived and cultural experiences without then saying, well, where are they and where they're not? And so to continue to be Melbourne-based and have that kind of centrality of one outcome in a rhythm didn't feel right anymore. And so if for us, taking that away means now we can support them where they live and work. And I think for a national or global conversation, that's far more interesting as well, to say, that's where you do your community engagement, that's where you build audience, that's where you sustain your practice and find a longevity in that, as opposed to the sexy premiere you might have in a Melbourne festival, and then you're disconnected from your community. And then, we're looking at a cohort of artists who increasingly have a diasporic relationship to somewhere else, whether it's in Australia or internationally. So even some of that international context, like what does that mean today? I don't think it's just about a market development and touring. It's actually about global sensibilities and that kind of cultural relevance. So for me, the transformation was a lot about that sort of stuff, and then reorienting how we center those things, and then finding the containers that then best nurture those that change in context for early career independent artists.
So let's talk about that. You used the word container there, and you're alluding, I believe, to one of the kind of key outcomes, I guess, of this transformation, which is All School, which is a platform that encompasses, I mean, you can talk to it, but essentially it tells a little bit about All School and how that has developed out of some of those discussions.
Yeah. Again, another privilege of the timing in which I inherited the organization. The previous team had found the funding for this, had a really basic proposal around what a learning program might look like. And when I sat on it, it made a lot of sense. We've always run Kickstart and a lot of artist development kind of platforms. Like, how do we now take that knowledge, that wealth of knowledge and experience, and offer it to more people in the artistic community? But then actually also, what is a more intergenerational conversation, and whose practices are we centering when we say learning and exchange as well? So All School kind of then flashed out, and it's still in a very iterative life in terms of testing the versions over the next year and the year after. And Emma is actually in the audience, who is the creative producer overseeing that. So if you see her around as well, say hi and talk about it. But we've essentially, in working nationally more meaningfully, then we also had to really think about how this platform would be hybrid, would have a digital presence, but even in that digital presence, what does that mean? And I think for us, it's about, in some ways loosely, a publishing platform to publish experimental offerings. And I say offerings because I think we can also reimagine what workshops or masterclasses might look like. We might use that language behind the scenes, but I think what we might see on the platform might look slightly differently because artists are doing those things differently. But yeah, I think what we want that space to be is that coming together of ideas, of testing, of works in progress, of the conversations around making work, as well as the skills and stuff and practice exchange, and yeah. That's kind of where it's designed to be, quite loosely, and again, being led by a creative producer who is a practitioner herself, and then the team and the artistic directorate, and we've been on a kind of co-design consultative space as well with peers around that programming, and so really looking at how it's really artist-led, and letting that shift in form and nature. But
great.
Yeah.
And a component of that will be, I believe, sort of performance-based insofar as a kind of a live stream performance component. And I wanted to swing back to that. The performances of Dorian Gray and Jekyll and Hyde, were they filmed and or live streamed at all?
They've only been filmed for archival purposes. They've never been live streamed. It's interesting, the intersection of the kind of live performance industry and the screen industry comes kind of head to head in a union discussion at the point in time when you're kind of talking about rights. And that's kind of sync rights on music, it's recording broadcast, royalties and payments, it's rights for the performers and the pools for the creatives and so on. So those works have never been streamed, there's been discussion about it. I think there's two barriers. One is that actually they're designed to be viewed as a live performance, and the translation to screen, we have done a high quality archival of one with the thought that maybe, but it just doesn't translate in the same way. But the other barrier to those works, and quite frankly most of our works actually turning into captured content, is that there is a huge amount of complexity still around the rights discussions, and those discussions are very slow and very painstaking, and they're very individual. You end up in extensive discussions with every agent for every actor, every creative and so on, and the economics of them just don't make sense at this point in time. So for a company that's strapped for resource and time, you kind of go, and that's not your core mission, is that really where you're going to invest the time when you know there's no economic return on it in any short-term or, quite frankly, long-term framework at this stage?
Can I respond to your question, Stu? Because I just had this conversation last night in a dress rehearsal with Devika and Amias, who are presenting Burial over the next 2 days at, and it's a Kickstart commission. And this came up, and they're working with technology. They're playing sound live. They're playing, they're editing video live for a work that we are essentially lying on the ground and watching this, immersing in this. And I think the question of live performance and liveness, right, I think to talk about recording is a moot point, because when we talk about liveness for who? And the essential part of live performance is a liveness that and Amias and Devika said this beautifully. There is a danger for performers when they're performing live. And there is also that equal vulnerability of experiencing life. And so yesterday, whether we knew they were playing the music, the sound live or the video live or not, didn't matter. I was lying on the ground, immersed in this space where I felt like I was moving in this space because the work moved me, not just emotionally, but like sensorially. And that liveness, which even at that moment, maybe the artist didn't completely understand, but the liveness is for the audience. So
and I think there is a film, there is a screen industry, and lots of great ways to look at things on small and big screens, and then there's the live performance, which is what and the kind of congregation of physical people in a place doing a thing. And I think I'm more interested in how technology changes that, how you use technology to change that live performance rather than just as, and maybe this is because, post-pandemic we're all, I watched all of the NT Live things that I'd never seen before, through the pandemic, and maybe I was desperate to get back into a theatre. But, the work that, the video work in the Kip's pieces, the set piece which we did at Rising last year with Nat and Anna's piece with that had video in it in a really incredible way that was very much part of the live experience. So it's using technology, but it's not just let's just get this to somebody who's not in the room right now. Although I do think, and we think about this a lot in South Australia is a big state, and we're 50% funded by the South Australian taxpayer. So what does that mean if you're physically very far away, or have there other barriers to your attendance? So I think there's a role for it, but I think it's more interesting when you say what are the technological tools that a director can use to really enhance the work so that it really engages an audience.
Yeah, but is it more than just having a role for it? I mean, the latest pattern makers survey that came out in January talked about 26% of people either having, I'm going to read this so that I don't misquote it, 26% of audiences identify as being disabled or close to someone who is. And so the issues that we talk about of liveness, of cost, of resourcing, obviously need to be balanced with access, and understanding that, you know, attending live performance can often be a privilege, you know, a privilege of wealth, a privilege of location, a privilege of mobility. Even if we just looked at it through those lens, through that lens, isn't there a way we can move through some of these sort of the liveness issue in order to open that up more?
But I think one of the things there is about the transformation of form. You know, fundamentally, theatre tells stories, as do movies, as do TV shows and so on. And so, you know, there are countless numbers of things where there's been a musical, there's been a stage show, there's been a book, and there's been a movie and a TV show. They're all forms of the same story. I mean, I think, yes, absolutely, there is a responsibility for us to try and find those access pathways, but we have to also accept that sometimes those access pathways are going to happen in a theatre as well. So the use of technology for, you know, predictive text, voice-to-text transfers so that you can get surtitling and so on across more performances, that sort of thing, hearing loops in theatre experiences. And yes, ideally, you'd be able to find some pathway for remote or financial viability, accessibility barriers. But there is also, it is a different thing. It is, you cannot actually replicate that same experience for people via delivering it via a different form. And to the point earlier about, you know, what is digital and that notion that, well, if you, I mean, I have a marketing team and I have a digital marketing manager and I rail against the title because I'm like, no, it's just a form of delivery. You didn't used to say the analog marketing manager when you sent a letter. And I think this...
I should, yeah.
But, you know, it's the form of delivery inherently changes the experience. And absolutely, we need to try and find pathways, but there's also pathways about, you know, the touring programs within Australia about taking work to regional audiences. Now, there's going to be limits there about can a theatre hold that scale show, or, you know, can they still get to the theatre because for physical access reasons. And there are some things that are going to be more accessible, and yes, we need to keep trying to make those, but I also think sometimes it's about making particular product that will actually serve that need in terms of being able to be transmitted through that form without significant degradation of the actual product, because I also think to give a product that is significantly less than what it originally was is also disingenuous and not respectful.
Sure. But I guess this might then lead into something slightly different from just that notion of capture or live streaming of performance,
agreed.
Which is moving away from that live form, moving away from capture into essentially a new form, because you know, we've seen, I think, scant few examples where theatre has translated to screen and retains the best of theatre and the best of screen. You know, you're either doing, if a straight capture will do a disservice to one or the other. It's not the greatest live experience, it's not necessarily the greatest screen experience. I don't know how many people would have seen this, but go and check out the trailer if you can find it online, because it's not available, I think, outside the UK. There's a production of Uncle Vanya that was done a couple of years ago, which was probably one of the best examples of sitting somewhere between essentially what a film or what a theatre production looks like. I've tried to describe it so many times and just can't, because when you see something new for the first time, it's hard to put words to it. So I guess I'm sort of looking and thinking about, I take all your points and like, is there an evolution of theatre more broadly that can transcend some of those
But I think there was, like, during lockdown, there were a couple of examples of, you know, theatre companies who were making work, and dance companies own lots of arts forms, who were making work for that distribution mechanism. And so, you know, so Sydney Dance Company, where I was at the time, made a lovely work called Quattro, which was done with Sydney Symphony, and it was, you know, filmed. It was created and filmed and for distribution, for broadcast distribution. There was a theatre piece that was made where it was performed live every night, but to camera. So you know, bought your ticket and went on at 7 o'clock and so on. So I do think there is this thing about it's a different form. And actually, if we think about the evolution of kind of theatre companies and the product that they make, the evolution might be that there is a stage model of work, and then there is a model of work that sits in a studio with cameras and is performed live to camera, but that the script and structural stuff around it is of theatre nature rather than film, i.e. it's live, You don't get to go back and edit and go, oh, cut, just do that one again and again.
Yeah.
It has all that vulnerability of being in that moment and just having to push through. But it is a different delivery mechanism. And I think, you know, for me, that's one of the kind of interesting opportunities around breaking down those access barriers,
Yeah.
rather than just degrading this other piece.
Yeah, it's trying to find a model, I suppose, that is not,
Well, and
it's
I-
not degrading the form.
Or that it's not
enhancing
just
it
like,
somehow.
it's not just watch it here or watch it here. Actually, what's the story that you're telling, and how are you capturing all of that, and what are the other ways that you could disseminate that to an audience that
Yeah.
wouldn't just be about filming it? I think there are, you know, that would go to your access point. And, you know, I think, and I think there's a lot of technological things that we can be doing so that the work that we present is more accessible to everybody. You know, we're doing a show this year with Windmill Theatre, Hans and Gret, which is a story of Hansel and Gretel, and they're using the headphone technology, which uses your cochlear implant technology, so that you can hear something in your head while still hearing something in the room. So it really starts to kind of mess with your head about what are you hearing? Am I hearing what you're hearing? You know, this kind of thing. And so that's a device. That's a theatrical device for that show, which will be very brilliant. And please come and see it. But actually, we're starting to talk with that. But there's an accessibility application for that too. That actually, if we can, you know, for an audience perspective, that could be used in a way that would make, you know, that you could think of multiple ways that you could use that in theatres that would help people who, not just people who are deaf and disabled, but people who have, you know, different attention spans and want to experience things differently.
Yeah.
I just want to put back my artist hat on and just also respond to, I feel like your question is kind of asking capital T theatre for how it might shift. But, you know, I think we think about contemporary performance
you're
and
not making that
experimental
kind of
theatre. Yeah, and no, but also that, you know, in the realm of contemporary performance and experimental theatre, technology as text, as material, and more than that, form and all of that, like, that those shifts have happened, actually. It exists, and artists are making that work. It's just, you know, a major theatre company has a remit to make capital T theatre, where some of that rules of what the form is still pretty true, and as it should stay. And then there's room for experimentation and whatnot, where, you know, I think that's where the breadth of the work is. So I think it's also, to remember that actually that changes and the experimentation have already occurred. Like, you know, thinking about Nat Randall's work, Second Woman, Next Wave work, you know, Regroup last year as well, and was at Sydney Opera House. Like, they're also experimenting with it. They just were doing it on a scale that is in the independent sector. So also, again, the sector is broad and big and multiplicitous.
Yeah.
And artist-led.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And I think one of the things, you know, that comes out of that is, you know, dare I say, generational, which is and it actually talks a little bit to some of the discussions we're having earlier, particularly Seb's point around group work in school and group work in education and the sort of collaborative nature, I guess, particularly of a lot of emerging multidisciplinary artists in that field, where digital, there's the word again, technology is second nature, is completely inherent to the work. But how do we balance that? How do we sort of look to and work with artists who are pushing form in that way, whilst, as Seb asked the question earlier, not wishing to put all the responsibility for solving problems to them? How do you balance the fragility, I guess, of that emerging practice and emerging discourse? Not even emerging, really, because it's pretty emerged. But certainly that kind of, you know, where that practice is sitting now.
Put them in a room. As in, you know, like, we're in, I think even like, I'm in my late 30s, right? And even I feel like, you know, 5 years ago I looked at Next Wave and I thought, you're not marketing to me. Actually, I'm not your audience. I think we're in a space of facilitating this organization to then better support them. And so the only way to know how to better support them is to put them in a room and be guided by them. Right? So, I think co-design and consultative processes are really about that approach. Just cannot, programming has to happen like that, I think, like full stop, as a methodology. The infrastructure will come, the technology exists, they have the language and the vocabulary, you know, that's, so and it's for us to catch up, not for us to, the challenge is, for us to keep catching up and then, let them lead it, actually.
Yeah.
I love the stuff that Jane was saying before about, you know, the kind of, don't you lose your curatorial expertise if you let the audience start making decisions for you. I think, well, no, that's the audience, keep up, you know. And we've been thinking about that with, you know, as we try and increase our own, you know, competency, capability, literacy, all of those things. But just by doing projects, and because with festivals you have to, you know, it's the same when we think about, you know, what's our responsibility and what we're going to do about reconciliation, about sustainability, about, you know, all of these kind of things. You think about that as an organisation, and you don't get anywhere. You've got to think about that as the festival, because that's what we're doing. And so thinking about how we start to diversify what the curatorial model looks like, and we're doing a project this year with, or for next year with University in Adelaide about machine learning, and actually working with students from that department, but thinking about how you curate work that comes out of that. So it's not about the work. We're not influencing how you create the work, but start thinking, because what a festival has that's sort of distinct from lots of other arts organisations is that curatorial kind of picture. So how do we start to change how that looks, so that in the future the audience might also look a bit different?
One of the things that sort of comes out of this, I think, is that, and sort of reflecting on some of my experiences at the Opera House, which is, you know, partially presenting venue in terms of receiving work, but also commissioning venue as well. But certainly when we talk about filming or recording or working with artists who are touring, let's say that it tends to be that artists who are presenting new work, who are at the kind of younger end of the spectrum, are more flexible in terms of, or more interested, let's say, and flexible in terms of how that work might be captured or filmed, or a new piece is created with them. And I wonder, you know, I mean, one of the things that kind of, to your point earlier, Anne, about rights, I mean, can we wait for generational change within, you know, rights managers and literary agents and so on? Like, because it's, as you know, as part of you're part of the LPA digital rights panel. It's a glacial process, and it seems to be moving so slow that there seems to be some sort of, you know, crunch emerging whereby that just will sort of, I don't know, run aground in some way.
And I think that's probably right if we leave it to that. And I absolutely think it's the younger artists and the independent artists that will lead that change, because they are far more in control of their own destiny around that. And so the opportunity that they create by being much more open and willing and able to look at those different forms of capture and distribution will push the rest of the industry forward, or drag the rest of the industry forward, probably. And that's fantastic, and I absolutely take my hat off to them, and I quite frankly would like the rest of the industry to just, come on, look, get dragged a little quicker. But you know, we can't just ignore it. It will, because if we don't challenge it and keep pushing it, the glacial will just stop and not speed up at all. So, you know, that digital rights working group that LPA has been convening for a number of years now has sort of made some progress, but really only probably in the education, the distribution of recorded content for education purposes. And beyond that, of course, other individual agreements are possible, but they are painful to negotiate, because you do start to cross over into that kind of the film rights world and so on. But I think that, to your point, Jamie, about the younger artists, the independent artists, the experimental artists, and are really pushing that distribution form and so much more comfortable. And it's also just part of their kind of world, and, you know, the opportunity, the bleed between a video going out on Insta versus a video that's captured for distribution on an aggregate platform like the Opera House, a streaming platform, versus, you know, any other form of distribution is actually just, it's distribution, all of it. Whereas within the kind of, you know, more structured framework around distribution rights, the differentiations are painful and negotiated at each and every point. And then there's a whole lot of greyness that just is muddy.
And whatever, you know, like you said earlier, whatever, you know, you manage to negotiate for one will be completely different for the other, and which can be extraordinarily painful. We could talk for a long time, but I'm conscious I'm the person sitting between you and lunch. So by all means, let's carry on the discussion later throughout the day. Thanks so much for your attention and your questions, and have a great day. And thanks very much to our great panel.